Hello, it's 31 years since Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke gave us HAL, the archetypal thinking computer of the film 2001, A Space Odyssey. But as we head towards the millennium, are we any nearer to achieving the thinking, feeling computer, or is it just a dream? And should it remain one? Igor Alexander is one of the leading figures in artificial intelligence. Professor at Imperial College London, he's credited as being the first person to design a computer which could recognise a human face. He's also the inventor of Magnus, a neural computer which he says is an artificially conscious machine. He's currently writing a book called Towards Conscious Machines. The philosopher John Searle has been described as being an avowed enemy of artificial intelligence. He invented an argument which is said to destroy the plausibility of the idea of conscious machines. It's called the Chinese room argument. Currently Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. His publications are numerous. He's just published Mind, Language and Society. Igor Alexander, can you tell us the difference between machine consciousness and human consciousness?
Yes, it's every bit of difference in the world. The reason we talk about machine consciousness at all is because it tells us something about real consciousness. What we do on a computer is to basically simulate the biological end of the brain, because in 40 years of artificial intelligence, this has been sadly lacking. People have been writing programs which do smart things, and they might even beat Kasparov at chess, but they haven't really handled the way in which biology creates consciousness. Now, what we do in artificially conscious systems, we basically simulate the brain and allow some behaviors to emerge from that, and we then study these behaviors and say, oh, that's a bit like consciousness in a human being, or it isn't at all. And it's which structures of the brain give us more of a conscious type behavior that are interesting, and those that give us less. That gives us a bit of a handle on the biological basis of consciousness. But the computer and the machine almost get out of that equation.
So you're saying that a conscious machine is an oxymoron?
Well, it's an interesting oxymoron. I like to think that, in fact, it does make sense as long as you use you put the word artificial in enormous capital letters and consciousness in tiny little 9-point print. The object of the exercise is to give us a bit more understanding of ourselves. Of course, as soon as you say the words artificially conscious machine, people think that you're building something that looks a bit like Schwarzenegger and it's going to rush out of the studio and kill everybody. And that's a great big misunderstanding in what we're trying to do. We haven't quite got around to that yet.
Professor Searle, what's your view on conscious machines?
Well, it's in a way, I'm a more extreme person on the other side. I think the brain is a machine. So we are conscious machines. I don't have any problem with conscious machines, and I don't indeed see any difficulty, in principle, in building an artificial machine that was conscious. My debate with people on the other side, such as it is, has been about the relation of consciousness and computation. And if you define computation as it's traditionally defined as a set of manipulation of zeros and ones, then I think it's obvious that that by itself isn't sufficient to guarantee consciousness. So I see the prospects of building artificial consciousness as not at all impossible. I mean, we're a long way from being able to do it because we don't know how our own brain does it. But the objection I have is that you could get that just by producing the right kind of external behavior. The point is you got to find out what's going on inside that produces the behavior. So my pocket calculator is better than I am at addition, but it's not conscious, not even close.
So how would you go about building your artificial consciousness machine?
Well, if I was going to build an artificial consciousness machine, the first thing is to find out how our brain does it. And in fact, that's the most exciting area of research in science today, is to try to figure out how that brain works. It's kind of a scandal that we really don't know how that damn thing works. And there's a lot of...
Why do you think you say it's a scandal? Why is it a scandal?
Well, it's a scandal because it's the most important organ we've got. I mean, it's the basis of our life. And we understand all kinds of things about our body. We understand DNA. We're starting to understand how the genotype produces the phenotype. We understand cell growth and division. We're even beginning to understand aging, I'm sorry to say. But we do not understand how this brain causes consciousness. We got 3 pounds, 1.5 kilograms of this stuff in our skull, and it has the texture of English oatmeal, texture of English porridge, and it produces not just consciousness, but memory and love and emotion and creativity, poetry, everything. I'd like to know how it does it. How does it work?
Does this make you feel that you're being rather reticent and diffident and a bit of a failure there, Igor? With your claims seem to be very limited compared with what you're being offered by your opponent.
Well, as John was speaking, my head was bobbing up and down, not because I was falling asleep, but because I agree with him so much. But an interesting question is, why is it so hard to understand the brain? Now, one reason is that it's very hard to do experiments on the brain. You can do psychological experiments, you can look at the structure of the brain, you can even do some super scanning of the brain, which is a little bit inaccurate, but it does tell you something. Now, this is where I feel we can make a contribution by moving some of this behavior into an artificial domain where we can tear it apart and we can have hypotheses. We can say, well, maybe the brain works in the way it does, for example, in vision. The vision system is incredibly complex. There are 48 little boxes in our heads which, at the end of doing their work, do something about giving us visual awareness. Now, there are hypotheses about how this might work, but they're hard to check. But when you've got a machine and you can simulate that system, you can say, well, okay, if you do it this way, it does appear to create visual awareness. If you do it another, it doesn't. So I'm very happy to feel that I'm contributing a little bit to what John's calling for in terms of getting a better understanding of the brain.
Well, I'm sorry to say that Igor and I don't seem to be disagreeing about anything. That, in fact, Igor defends a position I have called weak or cautious artificial intelligence, where you think of the simulation of cognitive capacities as like the simulation of anything else. I mean, we use the computer to study digestion or to do studies of weather patterns. And nobody thinks, well, if we do a computer simulation of a rainstorm, we're all going to get wet. And similarly, a computer simulation of consciousness isn't thereby conscious, but it's a very useful device for studying consciousness. So I would hesitate to call it artificial consciousness, but I like your other word. It's the simulation of consciousness, and that is immensely useful. So you can use the computer to study how the brain produces consciousness as you use the computer to study how the digestive tract produces digestion. The mistake that a lot of people make, and I'm pleased to see Igor doesn't make it, is to think that somehow or other the simulation is the real thing. And what I've always argued is that the simulation of consciousness stands to real consciousness the way the simulation of, say, digestion stands to real digestion. You get a perfect computer program to simulate digestion. That doesn't mean you can then stuff a pizza into the computer and it will digest it. No, it's just a picture or model. And that's what I think we get with the brain.
Do you think... Sorry, after you, Igor.
Well, I'd like to ask John a question, because you do say, John, very clearly that you feel that there could be some form of artificial object, I don't know, beer cans or whatever, that could, under certain conditions, become conscious. I believe that part of that track can be through virtual mechanisms, which in a virtual way do become conscious. The reason for that is that if consciousness wasn't the subject of my simulations, if I couldn't tell, well, this thing becomes more aware than that, it's artificial awareness, it's artificial. But at what point do we start calling that sort of stuff, oh yeah, it's some sort of artificial consciousness? It's not living consciousness. And that's the mistake I think people make, that they confuse living things with non-living things. That's the big distinction. But in the non-living domain, at what point would you accept that something's become conscious?
Yeah. Okay, now I think we may be getting a genuine disagreement. I'm pleased to see that. The point is, we know the brain does it. The brain is a biological mechanism. Now, if we're going to do the same thing using a non-biological mechanism, we know it follows logically we have to duplicate the brain's causal power to get us over the threshold of consciousness. Just as to build an artificial heart, you don't have to have muscle tissue, but you got to duplicate the heart's power to pump blood. Now, similarly, if we're going to do it with a brain, you got to find out how the brain does it and duplicate, not merely simulate that. So suppose that, as some current theories say, it's a specific set of biochemical and electrochemical mechanisms using the architecture of the thalamocortical system. That's a big hunk of tissue in the middle of the brain. Then what you do is find out what the electrochemical features of that are, and you then recreate those. You don't do computer model it. Zeros and ones aren't going to be enough to do it. You got to get the actual you got to get the actual causal power of the machinery, and that's what I would look for. Now, how would you test it? Well, the best way to tell whether or not a system is conscious is to be that system. But it's hard to do that with any system other than yourself. But for example, if parts of your brain were decaying and they were replaced with this artificial mechanism, and you kept your same consciousness, that would be pretty damn conclusive. You'd be pretty confident that that mechanism was producing, was causing, and not just simulating consciousness.
Do you think that is at all practical or possible, what's just been proposed by John Searle?
Well, I'm not exactly clear what John's proposing, because in some ways it comes through like you have to understand the biological first before you can do your simulations. I actually think that the two go together, that the sort of systematic character of what it is that causes consciousness is expressible in several ways. The biological way is obviously one, but at the end of the day, it's a very complex system. And it's understanding the essence of that system that's important. And I think the way you do that is by doing it on both sides, by doing some simulation and doing some brain work. But if you're stuck with brain work, then you're limited by experimental techniques and things.
Yes.
But because the subject of the artificial becomes consciousness, you have at some point got to say, okay, here we do have something which gives me clues about consciousness, which is not biological, and it might give us some clues about how the biological works. So the only difference between us is the perspective from which we arrive at the problem.
Yeah, but
I think it's plausible, and I think it's possible to do.
I want to emphasize, though, the word you used at the beginning, the notion of simulation.
Yeah.
And I don't think you have to understand the brain in order to do a simulation. I think the simulation may well be, as you pointed out, a device for helping us to understand how the brain works. But Melvin's question was, how would you produce the real thing? Not just a simulation of it, not just a picture or model of it, but the real damn thing. And there, it seems to me, you've got to know how the brain does it. And the simulation will help you to understand how the brain does it. But ultimately, if we're talking about computation, the simulation is all zeros and ones. It's a Turing machine. It consists. It's a series of algorithms.
But do you think you're going to get to a stage where you can have a machine which has, let's take a very simple, well, it's not a simple idea, but let's take something that people can associate with instantly, can have free will?
Let's just take that and surround it by the other things it will have to have besides free will, because defining free will, I think, is very difficult. And I think sometimes what people call free will is just arbitrary thinking. But there are a lot of other things which are needed for us to believe in free will. If I have a machine that is aware of its existing surroundings, knows its own position within that world, is able to shut off its senses and think about these surroundings, plan what it's going to do next, use in some sort of very fancy language system that we haven't got yet, use the word I in a convincing kind of way, I think you'd be able to stand away from this thing and say, well, let's try and get interested in how its consciousness works. Now, you ask this object, have you got free will? And he said, yeah, how do you want me to show you that I've got free will? I'm thinking of a monkey in a tree, and I did that totally freely. Nobody made me do that. So there are a lot of issues around the concept of free will, which can be dealt with in a very facile way, but there are a lot of other issues that aren't all that easy.
This is part of a larger question, is when you've simulated or duplicated the brain, do you have something which is the brain, or have we created something other than?
Well, you could create something other than in the sense of using a different causal mechanism, as you can create a diesel engine that'll power your car as well as a petrol engine. But what we're interested in is not that it does just an imitation of it, but that it actually produces the same causal effects. Now, you ask about free will, and that's a hard one, because we don't know how we get our own free will, and we don't know if maybe free will is maybe an illusion, because the brain looks like a biological mechanism like any other. Free will is a feature of a certain kind of human consciousness, and in order to produce that in a machine, we've got to first understand how we could produce consciousness at all, and then the hard part would be, after you've done that, as if that isn't hard enough, the next task would be to produce the kind of consciousness that human beings have when they're making free decisions, when they're engaged in some sort of free decision-making behavior. And that's a tough one. We're a long way from being able to do that.
Do you think it is... Do you think that you will sometime, at some time or other, given a following wind and enough time and enough intelligence brought to bear on it, and as Newton said, thinking on it continually, do you think you will be able to discover in the brain direct relationships between parts of our brain, things inside our skull, and, say, imagination? Do you think there's bound to be a direct connection there? Or do you think that at a certain stage, the mass that is the brain turns into something else, which becomes the mind and becomes consciousness, which is so elusive and so varied?
I don't think it turns into something else. Now, the one way to hear your question is to ask, well, will we be able to find localizations in the brain of specific capacities like imagination? And to some extent, we already have localizations. I mean, we understand the visual system, and we understand the auditory system, and we understand the language. To some extent, the language system tends to be on the left-hand side of the brain in most people. So we will get some sorts of localizations, but whether or not we'll get precise localizations, we'll be able to say right there is where you're imagining your seaside holiday, that seems to me unlikely, but still, it's a factual point.
But it's not just right there where you see a seaside holiday. It's more Francis Crick's astonishing hypothesis that these particular interactions between these firings, between these particular and specific neurons lead to that specific sort of imaginative thought. I mean, that is the sort of almost unimaginable detail. Is that at all on the agenda as being able to...
It seems to me it's got to work something like that, because we know that's the only machinery you've got to do it. You see, what seems so bizarre about it is you'll look at this plumbing. I mean, here it is. Here's this plumbing apparatus, and you think, that's what does the thinking. And the answer is yes, that's what does the thinking, and we want to know exactly how does it work.
These sort of intestinal coils of porridge.
You've got, the point about it is, you pointed out how hard it is to study. The reason it's so hard to study is you've got 100 billion neurons. That's a lot of neurons. And then the real action is taking place at the synapse, and there you got zillions. I mean, some neurons have as many as 100,000 synapses on one neuron, and there are days when I'm glad I'm not a neurobiologist, because it's very hard to study that. And they have this quaint vocabulary. They say, we do not have techniques that are not invasive. That means you got to destroy the brain to study it, or you got to stab the poor animal in order to get at the brain. Now, we've got these imaging techniques, and that's pretty good, the CAT scans, the PET scans, the MRI devices. But we're a long way from being able to get in there and figure out how it works in detail.
Given the size of the numbers and then the further complexity of the interaction of these numbers, so you're getting into numbers which are bigger than the size of the universe, as it were, what advances, what can machines such as those that you're working with achieve? How far along the road can they possibly get?
numbers don't worry me all that much. It's principles. I think if you can discover principles with simulations, indeed, which are much smaller than the sort of numbers that we have in our brains, then you can stand back in awe of the brain if you can discover some interesting things that happen in smaller numbers. Now, I think actually we're further down the road than John is implying in trying to understand that link. And I'm not talking about simulations now. I'm talking about the biological brain. And the big question always is, let me just touch the tip of my finger with these glasses. It's not television, so people have to imagine that I'm doing that. Now, all that happens in my brain is that something in my somatosensory cortex, which is somewhere where people wear their earphones, is firing away. The neurons are active. Now, that is not the only thing that's going on in my brain. That's the localized thing that's going on. And the question is, why don't I feel these neurons in my head? Why does it feel like something's happening in my finger? The reason is that there are a whole lot of other things that are going on in the brain which have to do with things that my muscles are doing, the things that my eyes are doing, the things that I'm recognizing with my eyes. And all that brain activity is coordinated into one item of consciousness which says that what's happening is out there and not in my head. And if you take that further to vision and other ways of other sensory effects, we're beginning to understand this very strange thing that we feel there's a coherent world out there which is totally distorted in the way it's represented in our heads. But all these representations come together and tell us there's a world out there.
Well, there's an evolutionary explanation, and that is, of course, unless the organism has some way to get information about the world out there, it's not going to be able to cope and not going to be able to survive. But the marvelous thing about consciousness, the absolutely wonderful thing, is we get all this diverse stimuli, and we put it all together in a single unified conscious field. So the perception of other people, the taste of the water that I'm drinking, the feeling of the clothes on my back, those are all part of a single unified conscious experience. Now the problem is, and we really don't know how to solve this problem yet, but a lot of good people are working on it, how do you get from the neuron firings to the conscious feeling? How does the brain get over the hump? And a lot of people think, well, we'll never understand that. But the point they forget is we know it happens. We know that the brain does it. And if we know the brain does it, we ought to be able to figure out how does it do it. And that's the most exciting problem in science today.
I flagged in the introduction this Chinese room theory. We've gone slightly away from that, but I know the number of calls and letters I'll get if we don't answer this, because one thing the British audience want, you keep your promises on programs like this, so we're going to for a few minutes talk about the Chinese room theory. Would you explain your
I'd
Chinese
be happy
room?
to,
because it is very famous in the field of artificial intelligence.
Well, it's a certain irony that you should ask me to do that, because I first did it on the airwaves right in this building, and when I did the Wreath lectures, I did it for the BBC. It's a very simple argument, and it's only directed at people who think that by designing a computer program, the right computer program, you thereby guarantee a thinking machine. Now, what I imagine is, take some cognitive capacity that I don't have. I don't speak Chinese. So you just imagine that I am locked in a room full of boxes of Chinese symbols, and I have a rule book called a computer program, and I get symbols in the form of questions. I look up what I'm supposed to do in the rule book, I follow the program, and I give symbols back in the form of answers. Now, on the outside of the room, anybody would say, well, that guy understands Chinese, because look, we ask him the questions and he gives the answers. But the point is, and I don't have any doubt about this, I don't understand a word of Chinese, and this is the point of the parable, since no computer program, no computer implementing a program has anything that I don't have, then if I don't understand Chinese on the basis of implementing the program, neither does any other digital computer on that basis. So the idea that you can produce the understanding just by running a computer program, that's enough, that's wrong.
Igor.
Well, I think John did the world an enormous service by putting this argument together.
Would you tell your colleagues in artificial intelligence that?
Well, you see, they don't actually accept me within the fraternity, so that's why I say what I say. But people are making outrageous claims about how a computer could understand a story, and it was quite obvious that if you asked it the right question, it would tell you that the question's invalid. And even now, when you ring up a large corporation and you get this machine that tells you if you want sales, press 1, and if you want the director, press 6, tells you exactly how far computers have got with language understanding. So, I'm very happy with what John did there, and in fact, it did underpin some of the directions that some of us took after that, and that is to actually discover where this aboutness, where this sort of rich representation that you need to get in a system, which is partly achieved by the evolution of the structure of the system and partly achieved by how this thing organizes its experience. That's where that kind of artificial intelligence came from, and it was due to John.
But it hasn't stopped people predicting and fantasizing about what thinking machines will be doing in the quite near future. Do you think these are harmless fantasies, or do you think that they're rather they're a bit of a nuisance, even a worry?
I think they do a lot of damage, and I'll tell you why. People get the illusion that all we need is better technology. And what the beauty of the Chinese room, it showed the technology doesn't matter. We're talking about the definition of computation in terms of symbol manipulation. So the two dangers were we'll get a technological fix for all our problems, and all that really matters is behavior. If you've got the machine that behaves as if it understood Chinese, then that's all that really counts. And both of those are serious mistakes.
Yes, I think technology has got to change a lot. It's not going to be the symbol manipulation technology of 50 years of AI that we've had. Technology that gets a little bit closer to hopefully what we understand about the brain in the future is much more likely to lead us towards more helpful machines which are heavily artificially tiny little conscious. But there will be more competent machines than ones we have around at the moment.
Finally, and reasonably briefly, because we're coming to the end, unfortunately, what do you think the use of artificial brain machines are?
Well, there are lots of uses right now. I mean, what I call weak AI is good for oil exploration, medical diagnoses, weather prediction. So just using AI programs for practical purposes, that seems to me perfectly legitimate.
Igor.
Yeah, I think making driving safer, making aeroplanes safer, getting us better telephone systems when you phone large corporations, those are the kind of things that we might converge on in the future.
Why do you think people are driven by this fantasy that they can be us, that we can create
will to power? I mean, what I discovered in AI, and Igor knows more about this than I do, a lot of these guys want to play God. They think, as one famous AI person told me, I am creating minds. You sit in front of the console, you sit in front of your monitor, and you type in programs in Lisp, and you're God. You're creating a mind. I think it's will to power. And it's exciting, I must say. I think it would be exciting.
Yes, I don't have ambitions of divinity, but
ambitions.
I'd quite like to be Walt Disney, but in that process, understand the brain a little bit better.
He gets paid better than God.
Thank you very much, Igor Alexander and John Searle. Next week I'll be joined by Ian Stewart and Brian Butterworth to discuss the beauty of mathematics, and thank you for listening.